Chapter 4. Spiritistic Phenomena. The following propositions have now been provisionally established. 1. The condition of the spiritistic psychic or medium and that of the hypnotic subject are identical at the time when their respective phenomena are produced. 2. That condition in both is what is known to science as hypnosis, or partial hypnosis, as the case may be. These propositions are demonstrated by the following facts. 1. The psychics in each case are in a more or less profound state of objective insensibility. 2. That state or condition in each case is induced by suggestion. 3. In each case, the psychic is constantly amenable to control by suggestion. 4. In each case, the power to read the minds of others is developed by persistence in the practice of entering the hypnotic or subjective condition. It has also been established, as a corollary of the foregoing propositions, that in the mind of each psychic a subjective hallucination can be induced by a suggestion, and that it is a matter of indifference whether it be an autosuggestion, a telepathic suggestion, or an oral suggestion. It is unnecessary to consume much time in the application of these facts to the ordinary manifestations of that intelligence which is alleged to proceed from disembodied spirits. It may not be amiss, however, to present an imaginary case exactly corresponding to those of everyday experience. The dramatis persona are a well-developed psychic and a client who is seeking for tangible evidence of a future life, and will be satisfied with nothing short of a test case of spirit identity. He is full of hope that he may be put in possession of indubitable evidence of the reality of spirit intercourse with the living, for he longs to establish communication with the loved and lost, longs for the touch of a vanished hand, and the sound of a voice that is still. But he does not mean to allow his emotions to warp his judgment, or to entertain a belief whose parentage can be traced to his desires alone. Perhaps he has heard of mind reading, and feels prepared to detect any evidence of the exercise of that power, or of any species of mental legerdemain. He takes care in the selection of a psychic, and seeks one who is utterly ignorant of his name, local habitation, and antecedents. Having found one possessing all the necessary qualifications, he seats himself and awaits results. The psychic enters the subjective state and presently begins his revelation. He begins by making an exhaustive inventory of his client's mental qualifications, whom he asserts to be a man of exalted character and gigantic intellect. He tells him that all he needs is opportunity to make his mark in the world, that he is not as well off in this world's goods as he would like to be, but that fame and fortune are near at hand, that he is a fearless investigator, but is not easily fooled, etc., etc. All this, however, in the estimation of the client, proves nothing but the good judgment of the psychic and the clearness of his perception of human character. Anybody might know all this at a glance, for that matter. It is not even good evidence of mind reading. Presently the psychic tells the client's name. He is somewhat startled, but reflects that it may have been obtained from the hotel register, or that it may be mind reading. The psychic then describes a spirit of which he sees a vision, relates all the circumstances of the death and burial of the person, and, perhaps, states the name of the deceased, the relationship borne to the client, and many little details which may or may not be true. In its important features, however, the statement is exact. It is the very person the client most desires to communicate with, but he is not satisfied. All this is plainly within the domain of mind reading, and he is not to be deceived. But he is interested and hopeful, and asks for a communication, which is given. It is couched in endearing, but general terms. Plenty of good advice is given, and it ends in a rhapsodical expression of assurance of a life beyond the grave and of a happy reunion. When life's fitful fever is over, the client is much affected, but reflects that all this is plainly within the capacity of the psychic. What he is after is a test, and he so informs the psychic. Presently the spirit relates some little episode which the client knows was within the exclusive knowledge of himself and the deceased. His doubts begin to vanish, but he reflects that the knowledge of the circumstance was in his mind, although he does not remember of having thought of it that day. The test is not conclusive, and he awaits further developments. Up to this point, the spiritist of average intelligence will agree that no valid evidence of spirit identity has been forthcoming. It is obviously all within the domain and possibilities of telepathy. Presently another spirit appears upon the scene. The psychic describes it with great minuteness and finally gives its name. The client is confounded. This cannot be mind reading, he soliloquizes, for I have not thought of that man for 20 years. He has crossed the Rubicon. The limit of his knowledge of telepathy has been reached, and to him it is no longer a tenable hypothesis. As if to make assurance doubly sure, this spirit recalls a business transaction between himself and the client which took place 40 years ago. The client racks his memory in vain for a trace of recollection of the transaction. He does not even remember of ever having had any business with the deceased. He knows, however, that he has the means of verifying the statement if it is true, and he closes the stance and hurries home to institute a search of his old records. He finds, to his surprise and delight, that his spirit friend is right in every particular. A proselyte is gained for Spiritism. Henceforth he haunts spirit mediums, and spirit mediums haunt him. Perchance his mind is not so warped that he ceases to recognize telepathy as a possible factor in alleged spirit intercourse. He may even admit that the great bulk of spiritistic phenomena can be accounted for by reference to telepathy, but he holds that there is a small residuum of phenomena that cannot be thus explained. Until within a very few years it would have been impossible, by invoking the aid of telepathy, to account for the phenomena which converted our friend. But it has now been ascertained that even if one does not happen to be consciously thinking of a particular spirit when that spirit is announced and correctly described, such a mental condition does not militate against the telepathic theory. On the contrary, it is clear that what one is consciously thinking of has no necessary connection with the subject of a telepathic message. Telepathy, as we have already seen, is the means of communication between subconscious intelligences, and it is only those who are psychically developed who can become conscious of the operations of the subjective intelligence. There are several things to be considered in this connection. First, it must be remembered that it is the subjective mind that reads, and is read, telepathically. Secondly, the memory of the subjective mind is prodigious and practically perfect, and it often happens that circumstances entirely forgotten by the objective mind of one who consults a psychic are recalled by his subjective mind. Hence it is that when the client declares that the circumstance never occurred, and afterwards ascertains that he was mistaken, it is no evidence whatever of the agency of disembodied spirits. Moreover, when we consider the perfection of subjective memory and the imperfection of objective recollection, it is extremely hazardous for anyone to say positively that he never knew a particular circumstance or thing. Such a statement can only be accepted as evidence that he does not recall the fact stated. Thirdly, the law of suggestion is an important factor which must be considered in the solution of the mystery. It is obvious that when two subjective intelligences are in communication, and each is dominated by the suggestions of Spiritism, and one is anxious to convince the objective intelligence of the other of the reality of spirit intercourse, and the other is anxious to be convinced and is seeking for a test case, the best tests within the combined resources of the two intelligences are more than likely to be forthcoming. This is certainly borne out by the experience of every intelligent investigator of the phenomena of Spiritism. I should not consider myself justified in supposing a subjective conspiracy to be possible, even under the inexorable law of suggestion. If a case of spirit identity had ever been made that was free from the doubts thrust upon us by the known laws of telepathy and suggestion. Thus far I have said nothing the essential features of which scientific investigators of the phenomena of Spiritism will not endorse. Indeed, I believe that intelligent spiritists very generally concede that phenomena of the character outlined in the foregoing remarks are not free from doubt, and they are ready to accept substantially the explanation here given. I now approach a branch of the subject, however, about which the most scientific investigators of the phenomena are at variance. It has been, and is now, my desire and purpose to avoid controversial argument on these topics, but I feel impelled by my very respect for two gentlemen who have arrived at slightly different conclusions from mine, to place my views alongside of theirs. So to speak, in order to allow our readers to judge which presents the better reason for the faith that is in him. I do so for the further reason that my desire to do exact justice to the cause of Spiritism impels me to state the position of two of its ablest champions with whose views I am acquainted. They are gentlemen whose reputation for learning and scientific attainments and for candor and transparent honesty of purpose is as wide as civilization, and places them at the head of the list of scientific champions of the cause of Spiritism. It is almost superfluous to now say that I refer to Reverend Minot J. Savage, of Boston, and F. W. H. Myers, of London. Neither of them needs any introduction to the English-speaking world. To Mr. Myers, the world owes more than it can ever repay for his indefatigable and purely scientific labors as Secretary of the London Society for Psychical Research. To Mr. Savage, the world owes much for his championship of free thought and of progress in every field of human endeavor. If I understand the views of Mr. Savage and Mr. Myers, they agree in their interpretation of such phenomena as I have outlined, and each would offer substantially the same explanation that I have suggested. But at this point our paths diverge. Each of those gentlemen is willing to admit that when a psychic transmits a message to his client containing information which is in his, the psychic's, possession, it cannot reasonably be attributed to the agency of disembodied spirits. Each is also willing to admit that when the message contains facts known to someone in his immediate presence and with whom he is in rapport, the agency of spirits of the dead cannot be presumed. Each will doubtless admit that subconscious memory may enter as a factor in the case, and that the subconscious intelligence, or, to use the favorite terminology employed by Mr. Myers to designate the subjective mind, the subliminal consciousness of the psychic or that of his client, may retain and use facts which the conscious, or objective, mind may have entirely forgotten. All these considerations, and many others, have doubtless entered into the calculations of both those gentlemen when estimating, in their careful and severely scientific way, the weight of evidence for and against the hypothesis of spirit intercourse. But here is where they pause. They are not willing to admit that telepathy can possibly enter as a factor in the case when the message contains facts not known either to the psychic or his client or any of the psychic's friends. I will now let Mr. Savage speak for himself. In an able address delivered before the American Psychical Society, he used the following words: "In the presence of psychics I have been told things which I know the psychic did not know and never had known. There is no longer the least shadow of a doubt of that in my mind. But I have always said this does not go far enough. Possibly this may mean telepathy only. Although the psychic is not a clairvoyant, is not conscious of possessing any means of getting at the contents of my mind, yet the psychic's mind may be a mirror in which my thoughts and knowledge are reflected, and I may be getting back only what I have given. So when I have gone only to that extent, I have felt that I have not gone far enough to convince me that I was dealing with a disembodied intelligence. But under certain conditions I have gone farther than that. And it is these other cases that we are always looking for as additional proof, these cases in which I have received communication concerning something which neither the psychic nor myself knew. There have been several cases not only in my own experience, but, more still, in the experience of persons whose judgment and power of investigation I trust as I trust my own, in which there has been the communication of intelligence that neither the psychic nor the sitter possessed nor ever did possess. I have had it in such circumstances as this. I have had communication while sitting in my study concerning things that were taking place 200 miles away. Over and over again occurrences like this have taken place, and I submit that my knowledge of science and philosophy does not give me any hint of an explanation for these things. It seems to me to be stretching the theory of telepathy and clairvoyance beyond probability to call them in to explain them. I do not know what to make of them except on the theory that some third and invisible intelligence was concerned. In a short but brilliant essay entitled Science and a Future Life, Mr. Myers thus sums up his own views and locates the line which marks the boundary between the two worlds. I am further strengthened in this belief by the study of the automatic phenomena briefly noticed above. I observe that in all the varieties of automatic action of which automatic writing may be taken as a prominent type, the contents of the messages given seem to be derived from three sources. First of all comes the automatist's own mind. From that the vast bulk of the messages are undoubtedly drawn, even when they refer to matters which the automatist once knew, but has entirely forgotten. Whatever has gone into the mind may come out of the mind, although this automatism may be the only way of getting at it. Secondly, there is a small percentage of messages apparently telepathic, containing, that is to say, facts probably unknown to the automatist, but known to some living person in his company or connected with him. But, thirdly, there is a still smaller residuum of messages which I cannot thus explain, messages which contain facts apparently not known to the automatist nor to any living friend of his, but known to some deceased person, perhaps to a total stranger to the living man whose hand is writing. I cannot avoid the conviction that in some way, however dreamlike and indirect, it is the departed personality which originates such messages as these. Here we have the clear and concise statements of two men, representatives, respectively, of the best thought on that side of the question, of two hemispheres, each defining the same limit of scientific explanation on mundane principles of spiritistic phenomena. These gentlemen, being, par excellence, the representatives of scientific spiritism on the two sides of the Atlantic, are entitled to a full hearing and a candid and respectful consideration. Their views, however, as quoted above, are stated in abstract form, and their exact meaning may not be readily comprehended. In order, therefore, that the reader may have a concrete illustration of just what is meant, it will be necessary to quote further from their works. Fortunately for our purpose, Mr. Savage has issued a volume recently, which is filled with well-authenticated facts which the author of the book cannot explain by reference to telepathy. I select at random the following case, which is fairly illustrative of the sticking point in its most pronounced, not to say virulent, form. In order to do Mr. Savage complete justice, I copy the entire narrative, including his comments. My next story goes far beyond any of these, and, well, I will ask the reader to decide as to whether there is any help in hypnotism or clairvoyance or mind reading, or any of the selves of the psychic, conscious or subconscious. Early on Friday morning, January 18, 1884, the steamer City of Columbus, en route from Boston to Savannah, was wrecked on the rocks off Gay Head, the southwestern point of Martha's Vineyard. Among the passengers was an elderly widow, the sister-in-law of one of my friends, and the mother of another. This lady, Mrs. K., and her sister, Mrs. B., had both been interested in psychic investigation and had held sittings with a psychic whom I will call Mrs. E. Mrs. B. was in poor health and was visited regularly for treatment on every Monday by the psychic, Mrs. E. On occasion of these professional visits, Mrs. B. and her sister, Mrs. K., would frequently have a sitting. This Mrs. E., the psychic, had been known to all the parties concerned for many years and was held in the highest respect. She lived in a town 15 or 20 miles from Boston. This, then, was the situation of affairs when the wreck of the steamer took place. The papers of Friday evening, January 18th, of course contained accounts of the disaster. On Saturday, January 19th, Dr. K., my friend, the son of Mrs. K., hastened down to the beach in search of the body of his mother. No trace whatever was discovered. He became satisfied that she was among the lost, but was not able to find the body. Saturday night he returned to the city. Sunday passed by. On Monday morning, the tuist, Mrs. E., came from her country home to give the customary treatment to her patient, Mrs. B. Dr. K. called on his aunt while Mrs. E. was there, and they decided to have a sitting, to see if there would come to them anything that even purported to be news from the missing mother and sister. Immediately Mrs. K. claimed to be present, and, along with many other matters, she told them three separate and distinct things which, if true, it was utterly impossible for either of them to have known. 1. She told them that, after the steamer had sailed, she had been able to exchange her inside stateroom for an outside one. All that any of them knew was that she had been obliged to take an inside room, and that she did not want it. 2. She told them that she played whist with some friends in the steamer saloon during the evening, and she further told them the names of the ones who had made up the table. 3. Then came the startling and utterly unexpected statement, "I do not want you to think of me as having been drowned. I was not drowned. When the alarm came, I was in my berth. Being frightened, I jumped up and rushed out of the stateroom. In the passageway, I was suddenly struck a blow on my head, and instantly it was over. So do not think of me as having gone through the process of drowning." Then she went on to speak of the friends she had found, and who were with her. This latter, of course, could not be verified, but the other things could be. It was learned, through survivors, that the matter of the stateroom and the whist, even to the partners, was precisely as had been stated. But how to verify the other statement, particularly as the body had not been discovered? All this was on Monday, the 21st. On Tuesday, the 22nd, the doctor and a friend went again to the beach. After a prolonged search among the bodies that had been recovered, they were able to identify that of the mother, and they found the right side of the head all crushed in by a blow. The impression made on the doctor at the sitting on Monday was that he had been talking with his mother. The psychic, Mrs. E., is not a clairvoyant, and there were many things connected with the sitting that made the strong impression of the mother's presence. Personality. In order to have obtained all these facts related under numbers 1, 2, and 3, the psychic would have had to be not only clairvoyant, but to have gotten into mental relations with several different people at the same time. The reading of several different minds at once, and also clairvoyant seeing, not only of the bruised head, but of the facts that took place on the Friday previous, this being Monday, all these multiplex and diverse operations going on simultaneously, make up a problem that the most ardent advocate of telepathy as a solvent of psychic facts would hardly regard as reasonably coming within its scope. Let us look at it clearly. Telepathy deals only with occurrences taking place at the time. I do not know of a case where clairvoyance is even claimed to see what were once facts, but which no longer exist. Then there must have been simultaneous communication with several minds. This, I think, is not even claimed as possible by anybody. Then let it be remembered that Mrs. E is not conscious of possessing either telepathic or clairvoyant power. Such is the problem. I express no opinion of my own. I only say that the doctor, my friend, is an educated, level-headed, noble man. He felt sure that he detected undoubted tokens of his mother's presence. If such a thing is ever possible, surely this is the explanation most simple and natural. Here, then, we have a case involving all the difficulties which stand in the way of accepting telepathy as a universal solvent for this class of mysteries. It is a representative case of the class specifically mentioned both by Mr. Savage and by Mr. Myers as being inexplicable by reference to telepathy J, for the message contained information not in the possession of the psychic, or of the client, or of any of the living friends of either. Consequently, if this case can be explained by reference to telepathy, clearly science will have a right to demand further proofs of spirit communion. Let us look at it clearly. In order to do so, we must first divest the case of several imaginary difficulties with which Mr. Savage seems to have environed it. For instance, he says that in order to have obtained all these facts related under numbers 1, 2, and 3, the psychic would have had to be not only clairvoyant, but to have gotten into mental relations with several different people at the same time. It is not entirely clear why it was necessary for all these multiplex and diverse operations to be going on simultaneously, or, indeed, why it should be necessary for all of them to go on at all. Nor does Mr. Savage throw any very clear light upon that question. On the contrary, he seems to have propounded an irrelevant problem, which he regards as insoluble, with the view of claiming a triumph if his readers fail to solve it. There are two groups of facts in this case which present themselves for consideration. One group consists of the facts which took place prior to the wreck, namely, the matter of the stateroom, the whist, and the partners. The other group comprises the particular circumstances attending the death of the lady. Now we are told that it was necessary for the psychic to see clairvoyantly not only the bruised body, but the facts that took place on the Friday previous. Mr. Savage holds the latter to be impossible for the reason that clairvoyance cannot see what were once facts but which no longer exist. In this proposition he is clearly right. But he would doubtless admit that clairvoyance is equal to the perception of the condition of the bruised body, and from that condition the manner of death, exactly as detailed in the message, could be clearly inferred. After all, that is the only fact which we are called upon to explain, since the facts that took place on the Friday previous were all known to surviving friends of the deceased, and the presumption is that they were all detailed to the son, who was frantically searching among the survivors for information which would throw light upon the fate of his mother. In the absence of any evidence or statement to the contrary, even by implication, this must be presumed. Clearly, then, it would not be necessary for the psychic to read several different minds at once in order to ascertain all the facts that took place on Friday, since those facts were in the mind of the son, and he was in presence of the psychic. But suppose that the facts had not yet been detailed to the son, it still does not involve the necessity for the psychic to be in simultaneous communication with several minds, since telepathic communion with any one of the survivors would have put her in possession of all the facts that occurred on Friday. That supposition would certainly do less violence to the principles of scientific inquiry than it does to postulate a supermundane origin for the phenomenon. I submit, therefore, that all the facts were easily ascertainable by the psychic by the exercise of clairvoyance and telepathy, each in its simplest and most direct mode of manifestation. The two powers, if both exist, are certainly not incompatible with each other. Indeed, They are so closely related that no one has yet been able to locate the boundary line between them. They are divided only by their definitions. I think that Mr. Savage will agree with me that, in the foregoing view of the case, my interpretation is to be preferred to his on the broad ground of inherent probability, since his explanation ascribes a supramundane origin to the phenomena, whilst mine ascribes it to those natural powers of the human mind the existence of which he freely admits. Nor does it fortify his view of the case to say that the psychic does not possess either telepathic or clairvoyant power, for that is simply begging the question. The very point in controversy is whether the phenomena of so-called spiritism proceed from spirits of the dead, or are the result of the exercise of the known powers of the living. And to say, as Mr. Savage does, that the psychic is not conscious of possessing either telepathic or clairvoyant power, is but another way of saying that this particular psychic believes that the messages transmitted through her come from disembodied spirits. It is a common thing among spiritistic psychics to disclaim telepathic or clairvoyant powers, and it is doubtless honestly done. Their theory is that their phenomena are produced by spirits of the dead, and that clairvoyance and telepathy have nothing whatever to do with it. In other words, that they are not conscious of possessing those powers. But when that statement is employed as an argument in support of the spiritistic hypothesis, it becomes a gross and palpable case of petitio principii. Thus far I have argued this case from Mr. Savage's own standpoint. That is, I have invoked the aid of those powers of the mind, and those only, which he knows men to possess, namely, telepathy and clairvoyance. I have shown how these alleged powers may have operated, each in its legitimate sphere of activity, to produce the phenomena he describes. He declares that he is in search of a working hypothesis which will explain these phenomena without the necessity of invoking supramundane agencies, but has thus far failed to find one. I have herein advanced one, the fundamental postulates of which are his. They are not mine. He believes in telepathy, and I agree with him. He believes in independent clairvoyance. I do not. He says that lie knows L that clairvoyance exists as a power of the human mind. J. Wish I possessed the same positive information. It would be a great simplifier of explanations, a short cut across a labyrinthine field. Like the hypothesis of spiritism, it is simpler than the scientific explanation of the phenomena, but its chief merit consists in the fact that it saves the trouble of thinking. I have looked in vain for indubitable evidence of the reality of the power of independent clairvoyance. I do not say that it does not exist. I do not know. I simply say that I have not yet been made acquainted with facts sufficient to remove the question from the domain of doubt and uncertainty. I do know that many phenomena which a few years ago were attributed to clairvoyance are now easily explicable by reference to telepathy, and I know that the field of the former is constantly narrowing, whilst that of the latter is correspondingly widening. I know that telepathy is a faculty of the human mind, and I feel safe when dealing with that proposition. But until the boundary line between telepathy and clairvoyance is defined with sufficient exactitude to demonstrate that there is any line at all, I shall not attempt to offer clairvoyance as a final explanation of any phenomena whatever. Now let us examine the phenomena presented by Mr. Savage from another point of view. I will begin by quoting a proposition of his, which, if true, disposes of the case at once and leaves him master of the situation. It is this: telepathy deals only with occurrences taking place at the time. If this proposition is true, Mr. Savage and Mr. Myers are both right in rejecting telepathy as a solvent for the mystery surrounding a very large class of cases. Whether it is true or not, it clearly defines their attitude and reveals the ground upon which they stand. In saying this, I do not wish to be understood as holding Mr. Myers responsible for the opinions of Mr. Savage, but as their conclusions are identical, I assume that they have reasoned from the same premises. I am confirmed in that belief for the reason that I can see no other possible ground for their conclusion. Be that as it may, the fact remains that the assertion that telepathy deals only with occurrences taking place at the time is a fundamental error of the most pronounced character. It is difficult to imagine an error that could be more misleading to the searcher after truth in the psychical realm, and hence more mischievous in its consequences, than this one is. Again, let us look at it clearly. What is telepathy? It has already been defined as the means of communication between subjective minds. In other words, it is the means of conveying information from one subjective mind to another. That it is confined in its operations to the subjective intelligence will not be disputed. It has already been sufficiently explained and requires no further remark in this connection, but will be demonstrated later on. Now, when a message is telepathically sent from one subjective mind to another, it conveys some item of information to the subjective mind that receives it. That information is henceforth a part of the mental equipment of the percipient's subjective mind, and, since the memory of the subjective mind is practically perfect, it is not likely to forget any important fact that may have been thus received. But suppose the percipient does not happen, at the time of the subjective reception of the message, to be in that peculiar mental condition required to enable him to elevate his subjective impressions above the threshold of his normal or objective consciousness. Is the message any the less a part of the subjective mental equipment? In other words, does a failure to become objectively conscious of the reception of the message delivered to the subconscious intelligence cause the latter instantly to forget the subject matter of the message? No one who is acquainted with the salient characteristics of the subjective intelligence, as developed in experimental psychology, will claim that it does. Suppose, then, that the recipient of the message does not belong to that class of sensitives who are able to elevate their subjective impressions above the threshold of consciousness. Then, suppose that a week later the recipient happens to be in the presence of a mind reader, and they hold a stance for the purpose of making experiments in telepathy. Is there any a priori reason why the telepathist should not be able to read that message as it exists, latent, in the mind of the recipient? If not, why not? If he can do so, the assumption that telepathy deals only with occurrences taking place at the time must be revised, and with its revision the whole fabric which has been so industriously built upon that foundation must fall. The only possible resource is to deny the proposition that a message received telepathically from one source can also be delivered by the same means to a third person. It will be necessary for us to discuss this point briefly, for it will eventually be seen that the whole fabric of Spiritism, scientifically and logically considered, rests upon a tacit denial of this proposition. My proposition is this: if A can communicate a fact telepathically to B, it follows that B can communicate the same fact telepathically to C. This seems to be a self-evident proposition, and no one, to my knowledge, has ventured specifically to deny its truth. Yet, as before intimated, if it is true, all of those difficulties vanish which Messrs. Savage and Myers experience in finding a telepathic explanation for their phenomena. I have had, says Mr. Savage, communication while sitting in my study concerning things that were taking place 200 miles away. And he declares that it seems to him to be stretching the theory of telepathy and of clairvoyance beyond probability to call them in to explain the fact. Why he thinks the explanation is outside the domain of clairvoyance, he does not tell us. It seems to me that if there is such a power as independent clairvoyance, the clairvoyant explanation is easy and perfect. But as I do not yet admit the genuineness of that power, I will try to help Mr. Savage to a telepathic explanation. He does not give us an account of the circumstances of his case, but as it is generic, I will furnish a specimen that covers the ground. The following case was related to me by a lady now living in Washington, for whose veracity and exalted character I can vouch. Some years ago she was residing in the interior of Pennsylvania. On one occasion she visited friends in Philadelphia, and during her stay she was induced to call on a then celebrated medium. Amongst other things, the medium told her that one of the children of the lady's family had just fallen from a tree and was apparently badly hurt. The statement did not make much impression on her, for she was rather skeptical on the subject of spirit communication, but when she went home she learned that it was literally true, and the hour corresponded very nearly to the time when she was at the stance. It transpired that the child was not badly hurt, although it was insensible when picked up. Mr. Savage would hold that it would be stretching the theory of telepathy to the breaking point to call it in to explain this case. Why? Is it not probable that the lady was in telepathic rapport with her family at home? And would it be stretching the theory of telepathy too far to suppose that she would be informed by that means of the disaster happening to one of her family? I think not. But the lady was not a psychic, and the message, consequently, remained below the threshold of her normal consciousness. The medium, however, was able to read her mind, and he found the fact recorded there as stated. In a work comprising 2 large volumes, entitled Phantasms of the Living, of which Mr. Myers is one of the authors, There are hundreds of cases recorded where telepathic messages were received informing the recipient of danger or disaster to loved ones at a distance. Mr. Myers and Mr. Savage will both agree that it would be in perfect accordance with the experience of mankind to suppose that the lady was telepathically informed of the accident. They will both agree that the message might have been received subjectively, and yet not brought within the domain of her normal consciousness, for that is also in strict accordance with the known facts of telepathy. Thus far we all travel along together very comfortably and harmoniously. But when the psychic imparts the information to the lady, the crucial question at once arises: how did he obtain it? Here are the two hypotheses. Mine is that he read the mind of the lady. In other words, he obtained telepathically the information that Messrs. Savage and Myers will both admit was, or might be, legitimately in her possession through telepathic agency. Their theory is that the spirit of some dead man was watching the child when it fell, and that he hastened to Philadelphia to hunt up a medium of communication between himself and the lady, so that he could tell her all about it. By a happy coincidence, he found the lady and a suitable medium already in consultation, looking for a test case upon which to postulate a theory of immortality. And it was forthcoming. According to Messrs. Savage and Myers, it was the crucial test demonstrative of spirit intercourse. If my hypothesis stretches the theory of telepathy too far, and if evidence of a mortal life consists in the adoption of their theory of explanation, well may we exclaim, on what a slender thread hang everlasting things. I ask the intelligent, unprejudiced reader to judge for himself which of the two explanations is more likely to be correct. To this end, he must ask himself whether it is more rational to suppose that the lady obtained a telepathic message from home and transmitted the same to the psychic, than it is to suppose that it required the intervention of a supramundane agency to convey the information. In answering this question, the logical and scientific axiom must not be lost sight of, that we have neither occasion nor logical right to seek a supramundane explanation of a phenomenon, when it is explicable by reference to natural laws with which the world is acquainted. On this point, the truly scientific reader will doubtless prefer to stand with Mr. Podmore, one of the secretaries of the Society for Psychical Research, who says, "When the choice of explanation seems to lie between telepathy and some faculty even more dubious and more remote from ordinary analogies, it is right that the hypothesis of telepathy should be strained if necessary to the breaking point before we invoke a stage deity to cut the knot."